All right, hi, I'm John Roncoroni, recently retired, Cooperative Extension Weed Science Farm Advisor here in Napa. And I'd like to talk today about the importance of weed control after harvest in the fall. So what we'll do today is go over some of the weeds that we have that we're expecting to see that can be problematic that we see after harvest. You know, historically, and I'm talking 30 years ago or before that, fall weed control was a common practice in vineyards. But with a reliance by growers on glyphosate, and the fact that glyphosate is a systemic herbicide moves in the sugars and photosynthates, that we've waited until after leaf drop or that very first frost before we've made our herbicide applications. So growers knew 30 years ago that it was important to do fall weed control, but what's happened lately is that we've really sort of waited until that Christmas period, or even waited until right before bud break to do our herbicide applications, or even in sometimes other cultivations. So what we're doing today is looking at these weeds that may have germinated during the summer, that won't go dormant or won't die during the winter, that can be problematic later. We have great examples of some of those weeds here. I'll start with this one as I get out of the way here. This one, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is Panicle-leaf Willowherb. Panicle-leaf Willowherb is classified as a summer annual, which means it's not supposed to germinate until the spring. But as you can see here, it germinated in the summer. Is a weed that we all know is tolerant of glyphosate, and is a very problematic weed. It'll end up growing tall enough to be into the clusters, and knowing that we have to do something, again, not being able to be controlled by glyphosate, cultivation or another herbicide would be needed to control this weed. Some other weeds here that are becoming more and more of a problem in fall weed control that we can't wait until spring to try and control. Another one here is Mallow or Cheeseweed. This one is pretty deeply rooted, but Cheeseweed is one of the first weeds that usually germinates in the fall, so that by the time we get into Christmas or into early spring, it's already well established and really hard to kill. So this would be a great time to try and get in either with a light cultivation or an herbicide treatment. I do want to say that when I talk about cultivation this time of year, we are talking specifically about very light cultivation. The last thing that we would want to do this time of year before going into what is hopefully a very rainy season is to loosen up the soil so that we have erosion. So we're looking at something maybe as a cultivation wheel or a light Clemens blade, nothing big that would be loosening up the soil that would cause erosion. So when we talk about doing weed control, it is very important to come in this time of year, give the soil with a light cultivation if that's the way you choose, to come in and give the soil a chance to reseal with some light rains before we hopefully get heavier rains in the wintertime. So I wanted to give an example here of why weeds growing in the fall are a problem. We have these really tall marestail or horseweed plants growing, and you can see that there's going to be a problem once we get to leaf fall. That first frost that we get, these leaves fall to the ground. We hope that they will blow off. These horseweeds are going to keep those leaves from blowing off, which means they'll be staying here. So the problem is that when we come in to do any kind of application, a post-emergent or pre-emergent application, these leaves will be protecting those weeds. So we've talked before about, several times you've heard me talk about cleaning off these leaves before we make an application. Well, as long as we have these tall weeds growing here, we're not going to be able to clean them off. So we're going to have to manually remove these horseweed plants and then be able to clean the leaves off. But in order to stop this from happening in the future, we may have to, one, do a cultivation so it's clean, two, use pre-emergent herbicide, just making sure that we have 1 year of this not happening so that next year the leaves will blow off. If we continually let these weeds grow, then the leaves will continue to build up, continually having the weeds germinated. So we really need to come in, concentrate, have 1 year of really good weed control so that the leaves will continually be able to blow off. Okay, so we have here stinkwort, and I think it's become very problematic. One, because of the smell, and if you can see here the height that this plant gets to, that if you were harvesting by machine, that could be right in that harvest zone, and if you take some off and smell it, you'll know it has that beautiful pine sol smell. This weed also is a problem for those of you who use animals to run animals in your vineyard for weed control. One, because this weed has very, very small hairs that will actually get in and cause irritation in goats and sheep in their stomachs. So you'll notice that if you run sheep through a vineyard like this, the sheep or goats will avoid this plant. It is one that when they say goats will eat everything, they will not eat stinkwort. One of the interesting things about stinkwort is you will see it is a composite, and it has this little yellow flower. It is usually the only thing that's green and flowering in and around the vineyards this time of year. So again, as I said before, it does germinate in about April. And what we've seen is that any pre-emergent herbicide use, because of that, will usually keep the population low. What we usually find, though, is it grows in the middles where we're not using herbicides, and then it can be moved over into the middles. Next to it is its very closely related cousin, horseweed or mare's tail. Again, a weed that has become a huge problem in vineyards. Just starting now to move into Napa. We are at this filming in Carneros, a southern part of Napa, which seems to have this, and American Canyon seem to have a lot more horseweed than we do farther north. But it is, like a lot of weeds, moving within the valley. This one, of course, is one of the first weeds to become completely resistant to glyphosate. There are very, very few herbicides that are good at controlling horseweed. We'll probably talk about those in future videos. This one not very deeply rooted, but you can see this is a plant that must have germinated sometime during the summer and now has a fairly woody stem. Cultivation may or may not work at this point. But the interesting thing about horseweed is this time of year we can find plants that are flowering and ready to seed, some that as we get a little bit later are in a rosette stage, and those that are very small seedlings. This plant, while classified as an annual, usually grows for about 18 months. All right, so here's a weed that I know is problematic not in every year, and it is in fact a biennial weed, and this is bristly oxtongue. Again, as I said, filming in Carneros today, bristly oxtongue is notorious for being a weed throughout Carneros, but also throughout the rest of the Napa Valley and a lot of areas in Sonoma and throughout the state. The interesting thing about, again, bristly oxtongue, those of you know that some weeds are very well are aptly named. If you look at the leaf of this plant, it does look like, if you've maybe never seen the tongue of an ox, you probably have seen the tongue of a cow, and they look very similar with the bumps and the hairs. But what I want to show you specifically about this one is you see we have plants now that are in the seeding stage, flower stage, also some that are in a rosette stage, and others, if we look closely over here, are just barely germinating now with the irrigation that we had at the right before harvest, or maybe even after harvest. So this weed, again, grows throughout the winter. We really, even though a lot of times we like to classify these weeds as biennial or summer annual, or even something that maybe is a biennial that germinates in the summertime or in the spring or fall. In California, because of our great weather, we really don't have that much seasonality, especially if we're drip irrigating through our dry season. There are, in fact, a couple other weeds that are growing here, and this one that I'm pulling out of the stinkwort that I talked about is prickly lettuce. Now, prickly lettuce is a weed that we associate growing through the wintertime and then dying in the summer. Well, we can see now we're at the end of summer. This plant is flowering. And how do we know that it's prickly lettuce as opposed to sow thistle or one of the other composite annual plants? Well, these plants have, if you look very closely at most stages of their life, there is a line of prickles right down the mid-vein. That'll tell you that this is in fact prickly lettuce, and it will have somewhat of a milky sap, but mostly it's those prickles right down the mid-vein telling you that it is prickly lettuce, an annual, but again, as with most of the annuals, actually a winter annual, growing in the wintertime and then dying hopefully in early summer, but you can see here it's still doing very well. Again, seasonality with our weeds here in this part of California really doesn't give us much help as to when the growing season is, since our growing season is most of the year. Okay, I found an example of white stem Filaree. Now, again, as we're filming here in a vineyard that was harvested for sparkling, so it's still fairly early in the summertime. Most grapes are probably still hanging in the valley, but this is a weed that we will see as we get into the cooler part of the season, and this is one that's growing sort of in the middle here, missed by cultivation, and it is white stem Filaree. Farther north up in the valley, we will have more red stem Filaree in the hilly areas. But the interesting thing about Filaree, it is along with malva and annual ryegrass, is one of the first weeds to germinate in the fall. So with this weed, and I'll go ahead and pull it out, the thing about Filaree is, and there's a lot of mixed feelings, I guess, about Filaree because it stays low, doesn't grow very large, dies fairly early. A lot of growers are inclined to keep Filaree in their vineyards. Other growers say that the thing about Filaree, it germinates early, then covers the other weeds, excuse me, as willowherb and those, so that if you're making applications, you're not really concerned with killing the Filaree, you are with the other weeds, and that this one protects them because it germinates early and spreads out, that it's more of a cover for other weeds than it actually is a problem. One of the weeds that I've been getting more and more calls about lately, which really in itself isn't a problem weed, is common purslane. Now, common purslane, not a weed that is usual to vineyards, and I think that because it's usually a nursery weed, is that this is coming in oftentimes when we're bringing grapes in for planting. So we usually see purslane for a few years in a newly planted nursery. It's a succulent. It may be one of the few things that grows through the summertime, but it is one that actually will, when it does get cold, usually does die out. But I get a lot more questions from people just not knowing what this weed is. And you can see, I don't know if you can see here in my hand, just by holding it, it's a pretty prolific seeder. So, and it does like hot weather. So anyway, this is common purslane. You'll see the yellow flower, very, very succulent weed. Again, not a huge problem in vineyard, one that I would worry about controlling, but you do see it in new vineyards. And it was just interesting, as we were leaving the vineyard, I talked before about the prickly lettuce and sow thistle, and here we have not prickly lettuce, but sow thistle. And actually this one is a little bit different than our common sow thistle. This is actually prickly sow thistle. I understand the names can sometimes be confusing, but no prickles down the mid-vein. It does have these sort of, not thorns, but a rough edge as the leaves. Common sow thistle would not have those edges. Again, just sort of for identification, when we're looking at controlling prickly lettuce and sow thistle, both fairly closely related composites, winter annuals. Usually our control methods would be the same, but just so you know that when you're out there, they are different. This one is sow thistle, the other one prickly lettuce. So here in this vineyard, we found some fluvelin in Carneros, but it's still late in the summertime. So this is still what we like to consider the summer version of fluvelin. As we get cooler into the season, we'll start seeing the fall variation of fluvelin, growing upright, the leaves almost hairless. This is the summer version. And we found this in a vineyard here, growing with some cover. It usually likes clean, bare soil. But fluvelin is a kind of weed you're going to find this time of year. As I talked before about the willowherb and trying to get in and control it early in the season, when we do that, if we're using pre-emergent herbicides that last 6 months, the fluvelin seems to be able to just wait until those herbicides are gone, and then it germinates. I realize that weeds can't determine that on their own. This one seems to be able to do that and will germinate as long as we irrigate all year long, except for the coldest months of the winter time. So fluvelin, I'm sure a lot more of you have become familiar with this. Again, it stays low. This weed can spread out to be about 6 feet, again being a huge problem, and actually can be a fairly heavy water user in the summertime, when it sometimes is the only weed growing. All right, we have a weed here that's not specific to fall. A lot of you call it perennial morning glory, but it is field bindweed. I like to make sure that we clarify that, in that bindweed, the genus is Convolvulus, where when it's morning glory, those are Ipomea. So it is different, but I think we all know that this field bindweed. And I wanted to show this weed here specifically here because of the stage that it's in. As you know here, bindweed now is flowering, and this isn't fully flowered. But when it comes to control methods, the use of Roundup or glyphosate or not, this is one of the very few weeds that I think is almost, the use of glyphosate is almost needed for complete control. Because it is, in this case, the rhizomes and branching roots may be down, 4 or 5 feet. So the thing about it though is, if we know anything about the way glyphosate works, is that it works only in the sugars and the photosynthates, is that this plant is usually only sending photosynthates down to those deep roots after it flowers, like most perennial plants. So in this case, this would be the time that we would want to, if flowering, it can happen earlier in the season, but this plant here, when it's starting to send, at this time of year, starting to send more photosynthates and sugars down to the roots, this is when we'd want to have it carried down. Now again, we would have to be careful because of this time of year in the grapes, knowing that we can't have any sort of drift onto the leaves. So this would be something, when you have spots like this, either maybe trying to just dig these out as deep as you can at this time of year and then come back next year, or spot treating, very carefully spot treating, because this weed will continue to come back. Again, the seeds on this plant last about 15 years. It really doesn't care about cultivation or cover, because most of its growing and as I like to call this, the tip of the iceberg, most of its biomass is 1 foot or 2 or 3 or 4 feet below soil. All right, here we have a weed that it starts in the fall, grows throughout the summer. It is, and I'm sure you can all tell by the flower, that it's a mustard. I know a lot of people say that we really want to encourage mustards in the vineyard. This is one that we do not want to encourage. Why? Unlike all the mustards that we plant, or the wild radish, or the any of those other cover crops, this one is weedy, and it's a perennial mustard. As you can see, it's not as showy as the other mustards that grow up. It actually has a fairly small rosette that grows up. This one, if I haven't said it, is short pod mustard. How do we know it's short pod mustard? Well, the pods that line along the stem here are short. So it's an easy way to tell if it's short pod mustard. It is, again, a perennial. So all those things that you would do to try and control an annual weed don't work that well on this weed. Again, it does look different than the other mustards that you'll see, or the radishes that are planted as a cover crop. So just again, short pod mustard. You'll see it flowering this time of year. Be on the lookout. All right, here we have a weed that's becoming more and more prominent in Napa Valley. It's been around a long time, but it seems to be getting more and more prevalent, is Bermuda grass. And the thing about Bermuda grass, and the reason we stopped here today in this late summer, early fall period, is you can see that at this point it is flowering. And just as I talked about with the bindweed, At this point is when, if we do use glyphosate, it will go down into those rhizomes and stolons and stop this weed. As you know, it is a perennial, oftentimes used as lawns. The other thing about this weed, though, is that besides the glyphosate, we do have some other systemic grass herbicides that can be used to control Bermuda grass, such as sethoxidin, which is post, or fluizafop, which is fusilade, or clethodim. And the interesting thing about those herbicides is that they don't need to be used at the time of seeding like we would with glyphosate. They can be used at any stage once it has a little bit of growth, because unlike systemic herbicides like glyphosate that only move with the photosynthates, those grass herbicides move both in the xylem and in the phloem, so in the water or the sugar systems. So we can try and control this earlier in the season at an earlier stage. But again, those are very grass-specific herbicides. If you were going to use something like glyphosate for control of this weed, now would be the time to use it against spot treating, being very careful not to hit any vines, because it is at that stage now when it's seeding out and starting to send photosynthates down into the rhizomes for next year's spring growth. Mowing, as you might think with Bermuda grass, doesn't help much because, as you know, it's used as a lawn. It can be dug out. It's not nearly as deep as bindweed, so if you're able to get down 2 or 3, 4 inches, dig it out, let it dry out, that may work, but you'd have to do that earlier in the season. Well, we had hoped to have you all out here for this tour through the vineyard talking about fall weed control and identification, but as a lot of you know, things haven't worked out the way we wanted them this year, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to do that. But I hope I got across the point today that, you know, controlling weeds, or at least knowing what the weeds you have in the fall, is very important. I know there's not a lot of downtime when it comes to working in a vineyard, and oftentimes once we're done with harvest, the last thing we want to do is go about and look at weeds. But I think it's really important as we look forward into the future of trying to control weeds in many different ways, that you have to know what they are and when to control them. And now, instead of letting it go through a winter, especially this year, if we maybe do get that chance of a nice wet winter, we may not be able to get back in till spring. So I hope you're all happy and well and staying safe, and hopefully we'll do this again soon. Take care.